my name is Joel. Last year, I put together a kit for a friend of mine, a really good quality vintage Ludwig drum kit. And I did that because he had been playing on a Pearl Roadshow kit that he had purchased for his daughter a couple of Christmases before. She didn't really take to the drums, but he started playing them and really enjoyed himself. He's actually a guitarist, not a drummer, and isn't every guitarist really a frustrated drummer? But he decided that he wanted better quality drums than the sort of really bottom entry-level drums that those were, with the cheap cymbals that they came with and stuff. He'd played my drums, he's played lots of other people's drums over the years, and he really wanted a good quality kit, even though he wasn't likely to ever actually play them out live necessarily or record them seriously or anything. But he wanted to have the ability to do that if he chose to, and more than anything, he just wanted to have a good quality kit while he's playing at home. So it's kind of a luxury, but since it wasn't going to really be a tool that he was using vocationally, he didn't want to spend a whole lot of money, so he was wanting to know if I might be able to build a quality kit like that relatively inexpensively. So we talked about budget, and he thought if we could keep it in the $1,000 range, that would be pretty cool. Now, $1,000 is a lot of money, but $1,000 for a really quality vintage drum kit, including cymbals, which he didn't have, hardware, the whole deal, the whole kit. That's a little bit of a task, but one that I certainly felt I was capable of doing, and so I got kind of energized. I love doing this kind of stuff, and I'm always buying and selling drums anyway, so I thought, absolutely, I'll keep my eye out for a vintage Ludwig kit. Now, he was wanting specifically the era of Ludwig that I like, the thicker maple poplar 6-ply shells of the late 70s through the mid 80s. So that's what I was on the lookout for. Also, he was not concerned about the drums matching. He realized I might be getting orphan drums individually from different places, and they may not have the same finish, and he wasn't particularly concerned about that since they were just for his own enjoyment. So that definitely helped in the search. The first thing I came up with was a 16-inch floor tom, late 70s, heavy maple poplar, blue olive badge, black Cortex, found it on Marketplace for $100. It was missing one leg, but otherwise was complete. And as it turns out, the drum was in fantastic condition. Indeed, it was just missing a leg, but it was really a great drum. And $100 for that drum is really good. Probably could have gone for more like $300 on eBay or something. So that was, I felt really glad to get that out of the way quickly. The next drum that I found was a bass drum, a 22 by 16-inch bass drum, same era, same line, in red Cortex. Found that also on Marketplace. Picked that up for $135. It had no front head and no front hoop. The hoop that was on it was an aftermarket hoop that did not fit, so I took that off. The head, I don't remember what head came on it. But the edges were in great shape. There was a crack in the red Cortex along one of the bearing edges, so I glued it down where the wrap was coming up because I didn't want it to continue cracking and getting worse. And there's a little piece of it missing, but once you put the drum head on, you can't see that. So that was perfectly fine. Being a 16-inch drum, it had two sets of spurs, which Ludwig did with their 16-inch deep bass drums at the time. One set of brackets was shot, so I threw those away. One set of brackets was fine, but there were no actual spurs. So I found some spurs online for $50. I think they were like $53 or something like that shipped. That was a little more than what I wanted to spend on that, but as it turns out, that's actually less expensive than a quality set of aftermarket spurs and didn't require additional retrofitting. I could just put them in and we're in business. So I did that. For the hoops, I actually had a pair of Slingerland hoops from the early 70s, one of which had broken at one point, but I glued it back and it was solid. They were kind of banged up, so I sanded them really well and painted them black. And in the groove, where there's normally an inlay, I actually just painted that groove with a color that was very similar to the red Cortex of the drum, rather than try to find some kind of material to glue into that inlay area. So that's paint instead of inlay, but the overall appearance is nice. And then I just put on some heads that I had. I'm always buying and selling drums, and I'm always keeping and switching out heads. I usually have a stack of heads in various diameters. And I had a set of Evans bass drum heads. I forget which model exactly they were, but they were great. They worked fine. They were in really good shape, and so I put those on the drum. And because it is a Ludwig bass drum, and because he wanted a Ludwig drum set, of course it has to have a logo. So because the front head was black, I got a white vinyl transfer logo that I put on the head, so that when all was said and done, it looked like a really nice Ludwig bass drum, which it is. In my mind, I was putting together a 4-piece kit. I thought that's what would be affordable, and so with a 22-inch bass drum and a 16-inch floor tom, the rack tom would make sense. It would be in either a 12-inch or a 13-inch, and I wanted the traditional depths, so like a 12 by 8 or a 13 by 9. Turns out, of that era of Ludwig drums, those sizes were pretty expensive. They definitely weren't fitting the budget that I had to work with. So what I wound up doing was creating a little bit more of a hassle for myself, but I'm very pleased that I did it, and the end result was excellent. But I purchased a power tom, a 12 by 11 inch, from the mid-'80s, from the Monroe era of Ludwig, after they had moved from Chicago to Monroe, North Carolina, so it had the Monroe Keystone badge, unlike the blue olive badge of the other two drums that I've discussed so far. And unfortunately, it had the modular tom mount, which pretty much all the Ludwig toms during the 80s had that mount. But that meant that if you didn't actually use that mount, you were left with a giant hole in the side of the drum. So I wanted to fill that hole. So what I did is I took the drum to John Zug at Dallas Drum, and he cut 3 inches off the bottom. Then I took it back home and I sanded the shell down to thoroughly scuff up the lacquer so that it would take glue and hold a wrap, because I was eventually going to wrap this drum when I was done modifying it. I took the piece that he cut off and drew a vertical line on it as well as on the drum shell itself, going through the hole, so that I could then cut out a piece of that portion that he had removed. So I used my drill to remove a plug of the discarded portion of the shell, and by using the vertical lines on the shell, I was able to line them up in such a way that the curvature would be appropriate, so that once I used wood filler and sanded it down, that it wouldn't leave any sort of a weird shape or bulge or anything under the wrap that was going to go over it. I took it to John Zug again. He wrapped it with a $5 piece of black gloss wrap that he got from Precision Drum in New York. It was a cut-off piece. They have on their specials page pieces that were cut off from larger pieces, but are still large enough to be used to wrap a drum. So rather than throw it away, they just sell it cheap. So this was a $5 piece of wrap, so it didn't cost much at all. And he wrapped it for me and then cut the bearing edge on the side that needed a bearing edge. The edge on the other side was still excellent from the factory, so he just matched that edge. And then I took it home, drilled all the holes, including a new hole for the badge. And I actually had a blue olive badge that I put on the drum so that it would visually match the other drums. And when all was said and done, it wound up looking great. And you might also notice, if you've looked at my other videos, you might recognize that drum from one of the first videos I did on this channel last year, which was about the pitch of a shell, and should you tune the drum to that pitch, and is that the best way to do it? And so I'll link to that video if you want to see it. But if you've seen that video, you might recognize this is the drum, this tom, that I used for that video. Next is the snare drum. Now the snare drum is the heart of the drum kit pretty much, and quite often you'll find it being the nicest drum on the kit. So I really wanted a good snare drum, but with budget being a consideration, I decided I would find an acrylite snare drum, which is an excellent professional level snare drum and a real chameleon. You can tune it and muffle it a variety of ways and get a broad range of tones from it. And they tend to be the least expensive professional drum that Ludwig made. They made a lot of them, and a few years ago, $1.25 would get you a really nice one. Now they're more like $225 to $250. I'm amazed at what they're going for. But a year ago when I was looking for this, the best deal that I could find was one that I think was $130 I got, or $130 or $135 shipped. And it did not have a strainer or a butt or the badge, which would have been a blue olive badge because it was a gray drum from the 70s, clearly. The shell was in good shape, but it was marked up visually. It wasn't very appealing looking. So I thought that I would sand it and put like a horizontal grain on it, make it look kind of a brushed finish. But that did not look good at all, and it highlighted every imperfection on the shell because the sanding would just skip over any low point where like maybe the lugs had been attached and things, and it just was not looking right at all, and it was wearing out my arm, and I thought, okay, different tact. I'm going to paint it, which I'd never done before, and it worked out quite well. May do it again in the future, but it's an aluminum shell. Aluminum doesn't really necessarily take paint terribly well, I understand, But I found some etching primer, which apparently works quite well with aluminum. And so I used that primer, and then I used a high-performance black paint that's made for automotive wheels. So I would assume that that's a fairly robust and sturdy paint that hopefully resists chipping and things like that. So I primed the drum shell inside and out, and I painted the drum shell inside and out. And then, since it was black, which acrylites were black in the 90s and early 2000s, sparkly black, Black Galaxy. But it had that appearance overall. I thought a black and white badge. Since it didn't have a badge, I actually had some black and white badges from a rocker kit that I parted out probably a year before. So I took one of those badges and put it on the drum, and the end result is really a beautiful drum, both visually and sonically. So that took care of the drums. As for the cymbals, I went to a buddy here in town who buys and sells drums way more than I do. And I figured he would probably have several cymbals to choose from. He did. I got a ride cymbal, a 20-inch A Zildjian Almond ride, and a pair of 14-inch A Zildjian New Beat hi-hats, all of which sounded excellent, had no cracks or flea bites. Got $100 for the ride and $100 for the pair of hats. I later got a 16-inch Paiste Innovations thin crash. Innovations was, I think, related to their signature line. It wasn't an inexpensive line of cymbals. It's a B8 alloy, and it had a unique hammering and lathing pattern that kind of gave it an interesting visual appearance. But it was a beautiful sounding cymbal, and despite the fact that it's B8 bronze instead of B20 like the others, it actually fit in quite well with the kit. And again, it was only $100 in amazing condition, perfect factory condition. So that took care of the cymbals, $300 for all the cymbals. The hardware was actually a set of hardware that I had left over from an 80s Tama Swing Star drum kit that I had done something with, I guess, a year or two ago. And I still had the hardware, bass drum pedal, snare drum stand, hi-hat stand, cymbal stand, and a cymbal boom, the full complement. And even though Swing Star was sort of their entry-level line, the stands were really well made in Japan, very sturdy, lightweight, but very stable, and very reliable, and they still were in great shape. So I threw those in for $100 for all of it, and actually threw in an extra snare drum stand that I had as well, because my original intent was to use the isolation mount for the tom, but since the bass drum was a virgin bass drum, it had never been drilled for a tom mount. I didn't want to drill it for a tom mount, so I figured I would clamp the tom onto a cymbal stand the way I do often with my own drums, but I have much heavier stands that can be very stable with a tom hanging off the side like that. Whereas the lighter weight Tama hardware that he had wasn't going to be terribly, terribly stable. It worked, but I was concerned there might be if it gets bumped, it might go over, and I didn't want that. So I went ahead and gave him a snare drum stand to mount the tom on. I'm not a giant fan of that because it robs the sustain. If you've ever put a tom on a snare drum stand and then you take the tom off the snare drum stand and hold it, or put it on an isolation mount or anything else, it's going to have way more sustain that just sort of dies when it's on a snare drum stand. But it still sounds really good, and it's very punchy, as you will hear in the clip. So that's where we are at the moment. If he wants to address the sustain issue with the rack tom, we can discuss how to do that in the future. But again, this is just a kit for him to play at home and to enjoy playing and learning to play, and do so with a quality instrument. So when all was said and done, the total wound up being $1,005.19. So I did go over just a little bit, but basically put that kit together, an excellent kit for $1,000. So I was pretty pleased with myself. He was pleased with it. You'll get to hear it in just a second. But first, thank you for watching this video. And if you like drums and building drums and anything drum related, this channel is one that I think you'll like. So I'd appreciate you subscribing and sharing and liking and all that good stuff. And I hope to see you next time. Thanks a lot.